So this is a very difficult task to talk to you when you're still having your dessert, your really nice end of the meal dessert, but do enjoy it while I try to engage you in talking about some of the research on school self-evaluation particularly. I know the program said I will be talking about external evaluations as well, but in the pre-meeting to prepare for this conference, we talked about the system here, and that is particularly on self-evaluation. So I decided to focus my presentation also on looking at research into what effective self-evaluations look like. And I just wanted to briefly start out with this statement by a colleague of mine in England who really talks about why it's important to have school self-evaluation, why it's important that schools know about how they are doing, to know how effective they are in spending the resources that they are given, in making sure that staff know how well they are doing, to be motivated and to have some sense of professional pride. That is all why it's important to have school self-evaluation. School self-evaluation has become increasingly important across Europe. If you look at Eurydice reports, for example, you see that more and more countries are increasing their emphasis on structured internal evaluation in addition to external evaluations. And that's because schools have become increasingly autonomous over the last decade. And many countries feel that you can give schools more autonomy in making decisions on how to spend their resources, for example, but then there needs to be some counterbalance to that in terms of evaluations of schools. We've already heard about the PISA shock before. I think many countries have suffered from that. And as a result of that, you see that many countries also start implementing evaluation systems as a way to deal with low performance and as a way to improve education. A strong focus on improvement is very much thought to be the outcome of increasing self-evaluations. So, to start off with a definition of what school self-evaluations are, because if we talk about self-evaluations, we talk about very many different models of evaluations. There are peer reviews, school inspections, high-stakes external tests, and that really flags up the question of what are self-evaluations? And in the definition that I always use with my students, I talk about evaluations that are performed by school staff who are actually involved in doing the work. So it's evaluations that are implemented by people who are actually involved in school activities. Looking at the functioning of the school in a very systematic manner. We already heard about the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle this morning. But to me, internal self-evaluations are also very important because you have a chance to actually define your own school-specific goals on what quality for your school looks like. What specific elements of your context are that you want to evaluate and that you use systematic resources to look at how you are doing as a school. And that's very much how self-evaluations are different from external evaluations, where you would have external targets or external standards that are used in evaluations. Now, often there would, of course, be kind of a combination in place. But the benefit of having self-evaluations compared to external evaluation is that there is more ownership to the evaluation. At least that's often what is said when comparing self-evaluations to external evaluations, that if schools have ownership over their evaluations, they have ownership over how they would implement these evaluations, then there would be more ownership to also acting on some of the findings. Looking at school-specific goals is another benefit. There are also some downsides to having only internal evaluations in place, and that is that there are often no benchmarks in place. There are often, with internal evaluations, no benchmarks where schools can compare themselves to other schools, for example, or to external targets, where we do know that those external benchmarks are also often a very big driver for improvement. Another downside of internal evaluations is also often mentioned in the literature, that they are sometimes suffer from bias. People evaluating their own work might not be as objective, for example, as external evaluators. So that is also something to consider. And that is why oftentimes many countries would use or would choose combinations of internal and external evaluations, or would choose some kind of peer review system where schools evaluate each other. I think you have something similar in place here as well. But what you would see in many countries is that there are, for example, external inspections in place that would use school self-evaluations as one of the sources to inform external school inspections. So very strong relations between internal and external evaluations, to kind of have both the benefits of strong self-evaluations in place, but also to add some of the benefits of external inspections to those systems, in terms of having external benchmarks, more objective data that can then also be used in school self-evaluations. I want to talk particularly about what effective self-evaluations look like. And I think in the discussions this morning, talking about what effective self-evaluations look like and kind of the next step, thank you. And also in thinking about the next steps for the Austrian situation, is that effective self-evaluations are those that are very much internalized to the school, where it's not a principal or a head teacher ticking off instruments, protocols, having quality assurance as a point on the agenda, but it not being part of the day-to-day school life. That's not what effective self-evaluations look like. Effective self-evaluations are very much part of the daily life of the school. They are part of what teachers are working on. They're part of daily conversations, and how to make sure that self-evaluations become that much integrated into the daily life of schools. That's what I want to talk about in the remainder of my presentation. And Adrie Visser and Robert Coe's framework about school performance feedback systems is very helpful in thinking about what effective self-evaluations look like. So I'm going to use their framework to talk about some of the issues in thinking about effective self-evaluations. And their framework starts with thinking about how both the design of an evaluation system, how features of such a system affect the use of school self-evaluations in schools, how some of the features of the school have an impact on that process, how the implementation process has an impact on the usage of self-evaluations, and how that leads to both intended and potentially unintended effects. So first of all, talking about the implementation process, I think this morning we've heard a lot about the tools, the support structure in place for school self-evaluations. And what we know from research on effective self-evaluations is that those systems are all very important in ensuring that schools actually do implement self-evaluations. But it's also important to have some tailored user training and school support in place. there's this notion of evaluation literacy, which talks about that teachers and head teachers actually need to have the knowledge to interpret evaluation findings. They need to be able to understand kind of data coming out of evaluation surveys or questionnaires. And that kind of knowledge is not a given. It's not that everyone would have that kind of knowledge. So in thinking about implementation of self-evaluation processes and instruments, it's very important to also consider the knowledge that people have to actually use those instruments and to provide some tailored support to schools to work with those kinds of systems. Also an important part of the implementation process is that there is some kind of external pressure in terms of implementing these systems. That is often helpful in making sure that schools actually use this kind of system. And that there is some, that there are some resources to actually work with these systems. Often teachers are very full on with just teaching, and then we expect them to also do evaluations, look at evaluation results and use them to improve their teaching, but they don't get extra time or resources to do that. So that's often a reason why these systems don't have an impact, because teachers, you just don't have the time to actually implement all these systems, protocols, instruments, etc. So these are some of the things that need to be taken into account when these kind of self-evaluation systems are designed. Another issue is that the goals of a system need to be very much elaborated in the indicators that are used in self-evaluations. If you have an evaluation system that is specifically targeted towards improving of teaching and learning in the classroom around specific functional skills, for example, in VET, then you need to make sure that self-evaluation tools and procedures actually gather information about those indicators. And often there's a disjoint in implementing self-evaluation systems that are not very much targeted towards what's happening in the classroom. The indicators in the system need to be very relevant for the people that are actually working with them. They need to elaborate on information that is useful for teachers and head teachers to actually improve the teaching and learning in their school. And that requires some flexibility in adapting instruments to local contexts, but also there is a need to have some level of standardization to be able to compare schools across contexts or across time. Then thinking about what effective self-evaluation systems look like, and there's a long list of indicators here that need to be taken into consideration. Some of these issues are very straightforward in that you have to have relevant information that is up to date, that is valid and reliable, but actually thinking about what that looks like on the ground is, you can immediately see the challenges for having effective self-evaluation systems in place. Because teachers, when they are using self-evaluation results to improve their teaching, they need it now. They need it now to be able to plan for next week's lessons, or they need it now when they are thinking about lesson plans for tomorrow, and to have self-evaluation systems that are actually providing information on that level. That's often not the case. Often self-evaluation instruments are on a very high school level, useful for the head teacher to make kind of evaluations of the curriculum or of very general improvement programs, but to have systems that actually have an impact on the classroom level, they need to be very specific in terms of providing teachers with relevant information. those types of systems also need to be able to provide information that shows trends across years, because that's relevant for schools to look at how the schools have evolved over a couple of years, to look at how student achievement has improved across the years. And to have those kind of systems in place actually requires quite some sophisticated information. And to have such information, particularly for vocational education and training, is very challenging, because just comparing primary and secondary education to vocational education and training, you see that there are very many instruments available for primary and secondary schools, very much focused on reading, writing, and mathematics, for example. There are a lot of also international benchmarked student achievement tests available that would compare countries on student achievement in these areas. And for primary and secondary schools, there is also a lot of research on school effectiveness, looking at what good teaching in primary schools looks like, how you can actually teach primary students in mathematics, but that information is not so much out there for the VET sector. There are not a lot of instruments that would test students on their level of functional skills, for example, and to be able to compare schools on how they are doing in teaching students towards these competencies. So thinking about quality of schools in VET, thinking about the role of companies or the labor market in providing schooling to students, or to organize on-the-job learning, it's a far more complicated issue to define and to measure quality in those great variety of settings. So I think that that's a key kind of thing to work on, and that's a key challenge also in designing high-quality systems, particularly for this kind of sector. So I have worked in vocational education and training in the Netherlands for a couple of years, looking at quality indicator frameworks there in a very dual system. And what this table indicates, and that's particularly relevant for the VET sector in the Netherlands, but I think is relevant for any country that has a dual system, is that there are many different stakeholders that have a role in schooling and teaching of students in this sector. It's not only schools often that have that role, but it's also the labor market, taking on apprentices, or providing courses to students, or thinking about qualifications for students, and taking a more active role in teaching of students compared to, for example, primary and secondary education. In the Netherlands, you would find that the labor market also has a very active role in examining students. They would have a very active role in thinking about and deciding upon the competencies that students have to reach at the end of education, and also on what examinations look like in vocational education and training. Now, those different stakeholders and all their roles in providing teaching to students also implies that these stakeholders need to be engaged in evaluation of schools, and also evaluating their own role in providing teaching and learning for students. So that makes the system of self-evaluation in VET even more complicated. But it's important to think about the different roles that different stakeholders have, their responsibilities, and whether they are actually living up to those responsibilities. This is a very brief framework that the Inspectorate of Education would use in the Netherlands to look at how all these stakeholders fulfill their roles, looking at specific aspects of quality of teaching in schools, for example. Going back to Visser and Co.'s framework, another important indicator of effective self-evaluations are obviously also the school organizational features. And we've talked about this in the morning as well, what kind of schools are well equipped and well qualified to implement and perform self-evaluations. Some of the key indicators here have to do with what we call innovation capacity of schools. Schools that have teams of teachers that very strongly cooperate, that look at evaluation findings as a team, talk about how to improve using some of these evaluation findings. Those are the types of schools that are very effective in implementing and using self-evaluations. Those schools would be learning-enriched schools. They would develop new skills to implement and interpret evaluations. And they would also be the schools where the head teacher would find extra resources to actually perform evaluations, implement evaluations, and make sure that teachers have the time to act on some of these findings. Finally, talking about what some of these outcomes are, or self-evaluations. And obviously you are very well equipped to talk about some of your own findings in this area, but usually in the research there are 4 different types of categories that we would use to describe the use of self-evaluations. The first one being kind of instrumental use, where teachers and head teachers take direct actions in response to self-evaluations. For example, implement new tests, implement new curricula, maybe change some of the instructional time to subjects that are not doing well, taking very specific improvement actions to act on some of these self-evaluation results. That's the first category. Then the second one about conceptual use is also a very important one, and I think that we've heard many examples of what quality assurance, what QBB has done so far in Austria, the kind of stage that many schools are in, is conceptual use, where implementation of self-evaluations would enhance discussions in the school about what quality looks like, what some of the strengths and weaknesses in the school are, to kind of frame people's thinking around quality and what that looks like in the school. That's a very kind of conceptual use, an initial stage of using evaluation findings. Then the third and fourth categories are more in the leaning towards what we would also call unintended consequences. A very symbolic use, where evaluation findings are only used to kind of talk about or promote the school to external partners, but not using the findings to actually improve the school. Or using findings to only make very quick fix improvements. Teaching to the test in high-stakes testing systems is another example of this. So we do also find that self-evaluations may have downsides, where it takes up a lot of time in schools, it would be very bureaucratic, or it would only be used for very political kind of goals. So obviously that kind of use is something that we want to try and steer away from. So when schools actually do use self-evaluations, create that kind of learning environment to use evaluation findings to improve, it may lead to improved student achievement, may lead to intensified achievement orientation on what students are actually learning, how to improve that, how to improve aspects of the teaching and learning process to generate higher student achievement, and to also think about how to improve teaching to actually enhance that. That is what we hope what we all hope will come out of putting so much time and effort into self-evaluations. So finally, I was given this question to kind of respond to, but I think there are also already so many post-its on the board, and mine is already up there as well. But I think as a kind of final remark, in thinking about effective self-evaluations, my message would be that it always has to be about what students are learning and how we know that they are learning the most and the best that they can in schools, and how all the people or different stakeholders in a school and in companies providing apprenticeships and all the stakeholders that are involved in teaching of schools can maximize that learning potential. I think that should be the focus of self-evaluations, and that systems need to be lenient and transparent and not bureaucratic to provide that knowledge to the people that actually enhance that, which are the teachers in the classroom. So that would be my kind of final takeaway message. Thank you.